Welcome to Father Matt's Bible Studies and Sermons podcast. In today's episode and Bible study, we continue our look at the book of Revelation, reading chapters 11 and 12. We begin by listening to a conversation from the Yale Bible Studies archive between professors Harry Attridge and David Bartlett. Hope you enjoy today's Bible study. God bless and have a great day. Let us pray. Almighty God, we ask your blessing on our Bible study. We pray particularly that the fires in Canada are put out quickly and safely, and that the air quality all over the Northeast clears up rapidly. All this we ask through Christ our Lord.
Amen.
Today we're going to start with the video from Harry Attridge and David Bartlett, recapping what we read last week, and then we're going to jump in and finish chapter 11, which we started, which is the beginning of the last of the seven trumpets. And I hope that we can get into the lady and the dragon and the beasts, which is the next section. So, but let's jump in and in the hopes that I can get this working properly, but I think I can without much difficulty. All right. Share. This is recapping what we read last week about the seven trumpets.
So, David, last time we were talking about the 144,000 and the great multitude, kind of interlude as the seven seals were being opened, just before the opening of the seventh seal. Beginning of chapter 8, that seventh seal is opened, and we immediately go into the next sequence of things, which is angels blowing trumpets.
Angels blowing trumpets with different messages implied by the different trumpets.
Right, and what's going on with these initial trumpets and the messages coming from them?
Well, insofar as I can see, one, it draws on, we've talked about this being apocalyptic literature, and it draws on a kind of familiar apocalyptic scenario, which is at the end the trumpet will sound. And also maybe a kind of hint at some of the imperial stuff that when you have imperial processions, you get trumpets. This trumpet is for God and for God's people. And then each of the trumpets somehow shows a way in which judgment is going to come. I think, again, not sequentially, but kind of one piled on the other. Stars falling and water turning into wormwood, one way after another in which judgment is. And interestingly, I have no idea where you go with this. At this point, it's a third of the earth. By the end, everything is going to be brought into judgment. Right now, we've got a third. So whether we have a kind of sense of gradualism in the finality of judgment, I'm not sure.
Mm-hmm. But it's definitely judgmental.
It's hugely judgmental, yeah.
And some of these things are really curious, aren't they? The fifth trumpet sounds, and we get a bunch of locusts coming up.
Very odd.
What's going on with that in chapter 9?
In my vast research, which includes mostly talking to you about all this, my sense that part of what Rome was facing was a threat from the east with the Parthians, and at some point, some of this idea of locusts, now it goes back, part of it goes back, I should have said this from the beginning, part of this goes back to Exodus, and notice how often kind of here and in other judgmental pieces, you have a kind of riff on the various plagues that struck Egypt. Now they begin to strike Rome. But the other piece on this is that these are locusts, these are highly militarized locusts. And that in terms of their armor and their power and their threat, they may represent the sense that on Rome's eastern border there is a power ready to threaten the government quite literally, not only theologically, but with arms, militarily.
And Parthians had invaded what came to be the Roman Empire.
The eastern end of the Roman Empire.
So
before. That was real. Mm-hmm. That was
right, and the locusts have a leader described in chapter 9.
Yeah.
Verse 11.
Yeah.
What do you make of that description of Abaddon and Apollyon?
Well, in Hebrew, Abaddon and the Greek Apollyon both mean the destroyer or destruction. They're a play on the word for destruction. But it's also the case that it sounds like a pun on the name Apollos, which was one often that the Roman emperors apparently claimed for themselves. I am the new Apollos. Particularly Domitian apparently did that, so that what you have a sense is that there's a kind of threefold pun going on. Here's Hebrew destruction, here's Greek destruction, here's the emperor claiming to be in the line of the gods, but actually naming himself as part of the destructive powers, not part of the redemptive powers.
Mm-hmm. And we'll see some sort of play on the figure of Apollo later on in
We will.
chapter 12, won't we?
Yeah, we
So
will.
it's probably
Apollo.
quite deliberate.
Quite deliberate,
Yeah.
sense that Apollo enters into all this.
Right. When we get through the fifth trumpet
Yeah.
and the locusts that sound like Parthian
Yeah.
cavalry,
Yeah.
with the sting in the tail, that's
Yeah.
mentioned a couple of times, so
Yeah.
it seems to be an important element for our author. Then we have the sixth trumpet, and what happens there?
Then you have a military imagery continues.
And it comes from?
And it comes from the east.
From the
It
east,
comes
from
from the
the
Euphrates.
Euphrates.
And so once again, it seems as if not only has John been reading his Old Testament, he's been reading the newspaper and has some sense of what's going on in the Roman Empire, which is really interesting. If you see him isolated on this island, what's his sources of information? What does he know? But he knows this, and he is perfectly willing to name the signs of the times, I think, without being a literalist about it, without saying this means we've got 6 days to go. But this is part of God's judgment.
Right. And we've thought in the past about the relationship between the fundamental theological claim that the book is making and its kind of short-term prophetic claims.
Yeah.
And insofar as there might be some sort of short-term political and
Yeah.
military prophecy, this supports it.
It supports it very much, and I think it sees it subordinate to the larger claim that God's kingdom of new heaven and earth is on the way. But that doesn't mean it doesn't impinge on our present situation. I think that's fair. In my preacherly mode, I'm sometimes willing to name judgment without thinking that it's the final judgment, or to claim that I know all about it. But it looks pretty much like the wrath of heaven sometimes.
Yeah, indeed. So in this sequence, we have another interlude,
Yeah.
as we did the last time in chapter 7,
Yeah.
which came between the sixth and the seventh seal. Here we have an interlude between the sixth and the seventh trumpet.
Yeah.
And this is a much longer interlude, right?
It's a much longer interlude.
Chapters 10 and 11.
Yeah.
What goes on in this interlude?
We have the angels, and the angels are getting to those 7 thunders. We never hear from all the thunders, but they're getting to, so we've got the 7 going on.
Right. It's almost as if our author had the notion he might do another
Yeah,
sequence
right.
of 7.
Well,
and then-
how about 7 thunders in that? Oh, no, I've
it.
kind of done 7. I've enough 7s for one day, right? Something like that. And then you have this picture of the rainbow somehow being up as part of the heavenly throne.
Is that coming from?
Well, it
the
sounds
Noah
like
story?
Genesis 9 and the rainbow covenant and the promise of God not destroying the earth by water again.
An interesting little gesture,
Yeah.
an allusion to a text like
An
that.
allusion to a text like that, and an allusion to hope again, right? So that in the midst of all the thunders and the plagues and the woes, you have this attention to the fact that God does send signs of hope. There's hope in heaven, and there's going to be hope on earth as well.
But then there's this bizarre image of eating a scroll.
Yeah.
And where was that
Well,
going?
it seems to me that's an Old Testament allusion again, where the prophet Ezekiel, in order to show how thoroughly what he speaks is the word of God, basically devours the scroll God gives him, and then belches forth the word of the Lord, essentially. So I think this is a way of saying that what I say is not simply my own opinion, not simply my best analysis of the political world in which we live, but this comes directly from God because I see it, because I eat it.
It's
And I'm
really
a prophet too.
a part of him.
It's a part of him. It's a part of him, and it also puts him in the prophetic line, along with Isaiah and Ezekiel, which is a claim we see he wants to make for himself.
So in some ways, chapter 10 seems to be kind of a digression from
It is kind of a digression.
either the images of gloom and doom
Yeah.
or the images of grace and protection.
Yeah, maybe to reinforce his own authority. Let me remind you who I am and why I have the right to say this.
Yeah, and maybe it's serving as a preparation for all of the visions that follow, the main visions of chapters 12 and
yeah.
to
I
14.
think back to our kind of orchestral image, there's a way in which you get almost like interludes between movements, which are leading up to the next big move in the symphony, and this is kind of an interlude to remind us who we are, where we are, and then wham, here it comes again.
Right. Okay, so the interlude continues, though, in chapter 11
Yeah.
with another set of rather negative images.
Yeah.
Right? What's going on there?
Well, in 11, you have, first of all, you have this interesting thing about those who are trying to measure the temple, and the 2 witnesses. So let me just nod at that for a minute. Remains entirely unclear to me who the 2 witnesses were. One of the commentaries I've read suggests that this is highly symbolic language, that Israel bears witness to Jesus and that the Gentiles who are believers bear witness to Jesus, and the 2 witnesses are these. There are not really many hints of that in the text itself. My suspicion is that he, John of Patmos, knows 2 people who have been faithful witnesses, who have won the victory in that sense, and is remembering them. and calls them to play here as on his side of the Great Divide.
Peter and Paul.
Peter and Paul, yeah, James, the
James
sons of Zebedee, who knows, something, some kind of combination of that. And then we have this beast coming up from the pit, which I think becomes two things. It's a one more way of talking about final destruction, but it's also a way about talking about final destruction in a way that's almost satanic. We've had all these things coming down from heaven, trumpets, bowls, woes. Now suddenly up from hell, from the abyss, comes this very different way of being, which I think is satanic and threatening and demonic and awful. And
we're going to see a little bit
and
more
we're going to see more as we go along.
character
So
in the next
suddenly
chapters.
this is not just bad things happening to good people. This is evil itself parading its power on earth.
Say a little bit more about what happens with the holy city and the temple at the beginning of chapter 11.
Yeah.
It seems to be under siege.
It's under
Is
siege.
this an allusion to contemporary events?
You
or-
wonder whether it looks back to the events of the 60s where it was under siege, and you wonder whether it looks ahead to the New Jerusalem. Why are you measuring this? Is it because I am thinking this for the first time? Is this a reversal all the way along? We've said the pattern for earth is going to be in heaven. Are we now finding an earthly pattern for the heavenly temple that's going to come? Do we look forward to a temple based on what has been destroyed and we hope to see restored?
So understanding this is a kind of prophetic text.
Yeah, kind of
rather
prophetic
than
text.
That
Yeah.
the New Jerusalem on earth is still going to be under siege.
It's still going to be under siege.
But the siege is going to be for a limited time, right? It's
Yeah.
1,260 days.
Yeah.
What's going on with that?
Well, it goes back to Daniel, who's always saying how long it's going to be before the temple is restored. And I forget how it all works, but I know it's 3 and 3.5 times. And
A time, 2 times,
time,
and
thank you.
half a time. yeah.
Time, 2 times and half a time. And I think this is playing with that sense that at its best, I think prophetic literature says that what is going to happen has temporal reality. We can name it as part of the future. We're hesitant to say just the day after tomorrow, or after the third Russian commissar shows up at the Olympics, the following 4 things are going to happen. But that, so to say, in a way symbolically, time, a time and a half a time, whatever, is a time, half a time, whatever it is, that times. It's numerical, but it's not precise, it's not arithmetical. And I think it's a way to say that what happens is temporal without being...
But it's limited.
But it's limited,
Yeah,
and
that's
that there will be redemption at the time of that limited time, as the temple would be restored for Daniel.
Right. And that prophecy in Daniel actually
Comes true,
came
yeah.
true, although the timing was a little off,
Yeah,
right? At
okay.
the end of Daniel, they have to recalculate.
Okay, yeah. Well,
but in any
we've been
case-
calculating Revelation for centuries now.
Yeah, that's right. So we have this image of the temple under siege.
Yeah.
We have witnesses who pay with their lives for their testimony. That's a note that we're going to get a little bit more. And we have the notion that there's a sequence of woes, right?
Right.
We heard the first woe after the first 4 trumpets
Yeah.
blew back there in chapter 9.
Yeah.
And then after this image of the city under siege, we have
second.
that identified as
Yeah.
the second
Yeah.
woe, which has passed.
Yeah.
And a third woe is coming
Yeah.
very soon. When do we hear the third
We
woe?
don't.
We don't.
We
yeah.
don't, so
This is one of these.
Another list of 7s he kind of...
Right. Yeah. It's almost a little bit of a literary hook, isn't it? Saying,
stay tuned.
Stay tuned.
Yeah.
Keep looking.
Yeah,
Keep looking.
yeah.
It's really interesting.
Yeah.
But then we have the 7th trumpet sounding.
So,
the
and now
angel
suddenly
blows.
the last trumpet, the trumpet will sound, is a redemptive trumpet, and calls people to worship and not simply to distress and to disaster, and becomes again a hymn, which is actually reflected in the Hallelujah chorus from Handel's Messiah.
And he shall
Reign forever and ever.
forever
And
and
becomes
ever.
at this point,
Hallelujah.
everybody should stand up and we take an offering.
Indeed. It ends on a very positive
There's on a very positive note, a reminder that finally this is about the power of God, not about the power of evil.
Right. I find verse 17 of chapter 11 particularly important in that regard. It's part of the Thanksgiving that ends this chapter. We give you thanks, Lord God Almighty, who are and who were. So the God of all eternity is the foundation of faith and hope. For you have taken your great power and begun to reign.
Yeah.
The end has begun
end has
already
begun.
in the midst of this
Yeah.
trial and tribulation. Yeah, I think that's a very important
So that you,
affirmation.
O God, are on the throne, but it doesn't always show.
Right.
But we believe that, we trust that, and we sing that. And then the servants become the prophets, and I think John includes himself among those. The prophets will be rewarded for their faithful witness.
A very important bit of celebration here.
Extraordinary important bit of celebration. Yep.
Okay.
Thank you, sir.
All right. Any comments on that? We read most of that last time. We did not finish chapter 11, so they got a little bit ahead of us. But any thoughts on that? All right. I will say that the next one, when Harry Attridge talks about the beasts and the dragon, is like a masterclass on Revelation. So when we get to the next one, it's one of the best ones. But let's read chapter 11 and go from there. Okay. Patrice, I think you were on first. Can you read the first two paragraphs and we'll go through that?
The two witnesses. Then I was given a measuring rod like a staff, and I was told, "Come and measure the temple of God and the altar and those who worship there. But do not measure the court outside the temple. Leave that out, for it is given over to the nations, and they will trample over the holy city for 42 months. And I will grant my two witnesses authority to prophesy for 1,260 days, wearing sackcloth. These are the two olive trees and the two lampstands that stand before the Lord of the earth. And if anyone wants to harm them, fire pours from their mouth and consumes their foes. Anyone who wants to harm them must be killed in this manner. They have authority to shut the sky so that no rain may fall during the days of their prophesying. And they have authority over the waters to turn them into blood and to strike the earth with every kind of plague as often as they desire."
All right. So Professor Bartlett talked a little bit about this. So they're measuring, we're in the, just to jump back for 1 second, we've had the interlude of the scroll last time. And if you jump back one other passage, we were at the 6th trumpet and we didn't get to the 7th trumpet. So our interlude is between the 6th and 7th trumpet. And last chapter, John was himself in line with the prophets, Ezekiel, Isaiah, eating a scroll, all of that. And now you've got two different witnesses who are measuring the temple. A lot of this is kind of unclear, but the imagery, at least that is being pulled from, is actually quite clear. Ezekiel at one point is measuring the temple. So that's a prophetic image. And if you remember down below, we read a long time ago. Anybody remember a prophet that stops the rain for a while? Does that ring a bell at all? There's a whole scene in 1 Kings of Elijah. There's a giant drought, and there's this very memorable scene where he's got this face-off with the other prophets, and they're trying to light a giant fire. And whoever God comes first to light the fire is the real God. And the prophets of Baal are jumping around, cutting themselves, and nothing happens. And Elijah says, you should shout louder because maybe he's asleep, and maybe he'll come and you'll wake him up if you shout louder. And then at the end of that, Elijah dumps water all over his pile of wood, and it burns up, and the drought eventually ends. So one of these witnesses looks in some ways suspiciously like Elijah, that has or they both do, the authority to stop the rain. And this second one, the water is turned to blood. Does anybody remember that happening anytime in the Old Testament? Priest, you're muted. You've got to answer, but
Yeah. Was it not Moses? It was the plagues.
it's Moses. Yeah, it's Moses.
Yeah.
Right. And so one of the things that we sometimes forget that it's in Deuteronomy is, and it comes up again and again in the New Testament as well, is the prototypical ideal prophet is actually Moses, right? So these two witnesses look like your two, who's talking to Jesus at the Transfiguration? It's Moses and Elijah, right? So they're your two representative prophets. Moses is the law as well, the law and the prophets. But these two witnesses look very much like a summary and allusions with an A, allusions back to what Old Testament prophets are supposed to look like. You've also got the 42 months and the 1,260 days. As they said, this is a straight allusion back to Daniel with 3.5 years. And it's two different ways of looking at time, 2 times a time, whatever it was. They couldn't get it right either. A time, 2 times, and a half a time, which is your 3.5 years. And again, it's an allusion to how long these things are going to be going on. But it's more of an illusion than a strict timeline. And sometimes people get caught up in the, it's going to be 42 months, or it's going to be 1,260 days, which is essentially the same thing. They're wearing sackcloth. We've seen that before. A lot of the prophets wear sackcloth as well. So who are these two witnesses? Our two professors gave us 2 nice examples of what they might be. Maybe Peter and Paul, maybe 2 of the other apostles, maybe 2 faithful Christians that John knew that sort of acted like prophets in their own time. Maybe the Jews and the Gentiles. You can't pin it down. And when people start trying to pin it down and looking for the specific days when these things are all going to happen or be completed, I think they often miss the point, which is that it's in line and alluding back to the Old Testament, and there could be 2 witnesses, and then in 50 years another 2 witnesses, that sort of thing. So there's witnesses essentially that are, even in the face of all of this bad stuff that's going on, continue to be faithful, and it's couched in very apocalyptic language with fire pouring from their mouths and that sort of thing. But I think those are the allusions, and kind of what you do with it is up to you. So it's the what does it mean for me today portion of it. Figure it out, but at least you know some of the background. Does that make any sense at all? I hope so. Okay. Let's keep, any questions on those 2 first paragraphs? All right, we continue with our witnesses. James, can you read down to the end of the 3rd woe?
Down to about 14.
Yeah, 7 through 14.
Okay. When they have finished their testimony, the beast that comes up from the bottomless pit will wage war on them and conquer them and kill them. And their dead bodies will lie in the street of the great city that is prophetically called Sodom and Egypt, where also their Lord was crucified. For 3.5 days, members of the peoples and tribes and languages and nations will gaze at their dead bodies and refuse to let them be placed in a tomb. And the inhabitants of the earth will gloat over them and celebrate and exchange presents, because these 2 prophets tormented the inhabitants of the earth. But after the 3.5 days, the breath of life from God entered the 2 witnesses, and they stood on their feet, and those who saw them were terrified. Then they heard a loud voice from heaven saying to them, "Come up here." And they went up to heaven in a cloud, while their enemies watched them. At that moment, there was a great earthquake, and 1/10 of the city fell. 7,000 people were killed in the earthquake, and the rest were terrified and gave glory to the God of heaven.
Keep going.
Oh, the 2nd woe has passed. The 3rd woe is coming very soon.
Okay. There's a fair amount in here, and our professors did not talk much about this. We'll see more of beasts in the next couple of chapters, but David Bartlett said, I think accurately, that now you've switched from not just an earthly thing, but basically a satanic thing coming out of a bottomless pit that we saw earlier. And this beast comes out and kills our 2 prophet witnesses. And then there's a couple of imagery things, which is You've heard of Sodom. You've heard of Egypt. It's worth noting that Egypt is not a city. Egypt is a whole country. And you probably know where their Lord was crucified, right? That's Jerusalem. And so there's references back to great time. What happened in Sodom, right? It was destroyed. And what happened in Egypt? It was wiped out with plagues, and then the Red Sea and that sort of thing. And if you know your history, what happened to Jerusalem in 70 AD? The temple is destroyed, and the Romans basically destroyed the city. So these are all sort of in line with throughout history, there's been prophetic witnesses, and Abraham was at Sodom, and Moses was at Egypt, and Jesus is obviously in Jerusalem, that have been, and throughout all of the Old Testament, the prophets are generally not treated well. And you may remember from some of the things that Jesus says, where he says, you know, you killed the prophets and that sort of thing. So they're in line with all these other prophets. And then you get some wonderful numbers again. And I think most of us, when we hear 3 days, probably jump to the resurrection, right? If you've been reading through this and you just read Daniel, you're also going to remember Daniel, because Daniel has 3.5 years, or a time, 2 times and a half. So this is also a reference to the end of times that will come in Daniel. And I think it's pretty clearly a reference to back into the Gospels with the resurrection. And there's a whole bunch of stuff that seems very much linked to that in this, right? There's 3 days and a tomb, and if you keep going, they come back to life after 3.5 days, and they stand on their feet. And then we just celebrated this a couple of weeks ago. Then they ascend up into heaven, just like Jesus does at the ascension at the end of Luke and in Acts. And there's a great earthquake. And if you remember St. Matthew's gospel, right, when Jesus is crucified, there's a huge earthquake. So there's, again, I think a bunch of allusions back to the crucifixion and to the resurrection. And I think the point here in these 2 passages is that despite all of the persecution that our witnesses and people like them before them, and all of us who may be persecuted as well afterwards, despite that, even if we are faithful to the end and give our lives like Jesus, we will, like Jesus, rise and be brought into heaven. And our sort of reward, so to speak, for being faithful is that we are not part of this same punishment. I think that's what's going on here. Any comments or questions in that? It's a little bit, Revelation is never all that clear, but it's a little bit clearer when you know and can sort of identify the reference points. And part of the problem that people have is because they're allusions, again with an A, and they're not straight up quotes like we may be used to in the gospel, where something is specifically quoted and the scene is narrated in a way that it lines up pretty exactly with the quote. Revelation doesn't do that. It takes imagery and things from other places in the scriptures and kind of gives you a new twist on them. So you can never really get beyond seeing what the allusions are and then trying to figure out, okay, you put all that together and what does it mean for us? So I think what it means for us is if you're persecuted and you're faithful, you're still going to be all right, even if it gets really, really bad and you die. All right. We had our second woe, and the third woe is coming very soon, as our professors noted. We don't get it, at least not now. But this is interesting. If you remember, and it's kind of funny following this second woe, we've had a full pattern of usually 7s, sometimes 3s, but usually 7s, where we get this big buildup, constantly waiting for the 6th seal or the 6th trumpet. And after the 6th trumpet, there were 7 thunders, and those kind of peter out, and we don't really get all of those. And finally, we do get a big 7th, which we've been waiting for, and it sets the stage for what comes afterwards. So I think as a reader, as you're going through, you would probably read this and think, oh, good, maybe not oh, good, but oh, we've been waiting for this. What comes next? So, Sherry, can you read the seventh trumpet?
Then the seventh angel blew his trumpet, and there were loud voices in heaven saying, "The kingdom of the world has become the kingdom of our Lord and of his Messiah, and he will reign forever and ever." Then the 24 elders who sit on their thrones before God fell on their faces and worshiped God, singing, "We give you thanks, Lord God Almighty, who are and who were, for you have taken your great power and begun to reign. The nations raged, but your wrath has come, and the time for judging the dead, for rewarding your servants, the prophets and saints, and all who fear your name, both small and great, and for destroying those who destroy the earth." Then God's temple in heaven was opened, and the ark of his covenant was seen within his temple, and there were flashes of lightning, rumblings, peals of thunder, an earthquake, and heavy hail.
Great. Okay, so our seventh trumpet, as Professor Bartlett said, is actually fairly positive, and it's a response to the death and resurrection of the two witnesses. And it basically says, in song, and as an aside, if you're wondering whether or not when scholars talk about the different style of different biblical books and say, well, this John of Patmos is probably not the same John of the Gospel of John. One of the key stylistic features is that Revelation is full of songs, and the Gospel according to John doesn't have any songs in it at all. It's not, so there's things like that. This is more in line with St. Luke in some ways. Luke has lots of songs in his Gospel. Luke probably didn't write this. This person's name is John. But there's different stylistic features here. And one of the big styles of John is that there's a lot of hymns and songs mixed throughout. And usually when the hymns and songs are sung, it's a good thing. And so we get this image that brings together a decent amount of stuff that we've already seen. We've run into the 24 elders already. We already know they're at the throne and they've already been worshiping. So now we're back to that scene. And they're singing this song, which essentially says, this is now the time that we've been waiting for, when God will reign, and this judgment is now coming. And it has to do with getting through persecution and the reward for the servants and the prophets and the saints they will get their resurrection from the dead. And their reward also is judgment on those that persecuted them. And then you get again an image back to Exodus and beyond, into the temple period as well. The Ark of the Covenant is there. And if you remember, the Ark of the Covenant has been taken from the temple long before, right? It wasn't in Herod's temple at all. When we go backwards, the Ark of the Covenant disappears after the first temple is destroyed and the Babylonian captivity happens. And there's a lot of questions about where it has gone. We talked about that, if you were in the class several years back, in terms of maybe Elijah took it and hid it somewhere. That's one tradition. You probably know the Ethiopian Orthodox Church says they have it. And what have you, but it was missing and has remained missing since the first temple. So it wasn't in the second temple. And by the time this is written, the second temple has been destroyed in 70 AD. So we have the real temple in heaven, and the real Ark of the Covenant is there within that temple. And we have all the same things that we would have seen in the book of Numbers and other places, Judges as well. That accompany, which you're familiar with from Raiders of the Lost Ark, the Indiana Jones movie, right? When you get near the Ark, lightning and thunder and earthquakes and hail all happen. George Lucas and Steven Spielberg were not making up that imagery. That comes from standard Ark of the Covenant imagery in the Bible, which our author of Revelation picks up. So anything on the seventh trumpet? All right. Now we get to the juicy stuff that everybody's been waiting for. The woman and the dragon, and then Saint Michael. JD, can you read the woman and the dragon?
A great portent appeared in heaven, a woman clothed with the sun, with the moon under her feet, and on her head a crown of 12 stars. She was pregnant and was crying out in birth pangs, in the agony of giving birth. Then another portent appeared in heaven, a great red dragon, with 7 heads and 10 horns, and 7 diadems on his heads. His tail swept down a third of the stars of heaven and threw them to the earth. Then the dragon stood before the woman who was about to deliver a child, so that he might devour her child as soon as it was born. And she gave birth to a son, a male child who was to rule all the nations with a scepter of iron. But her child was snatched away and taken to God and to his throne, and the woman fled into the wilderness, where she has a place prepared by God. So there she can be nourished for 1,260 days.
Great. Who's the woman?
Mary?
Maybe. Any other guesses? Most of your imagery of Mary will say that Mary is this woman, right?
Right.
In art, it's not uncommon to see Mary clothed with the sun, with the moon under her feet, and a crown of 12 stars.
Right.
But that analogy runs into a little bit of problem, or identification runs into a little bit of a problem with this chunk right here, because this looks a little bit less, well, not the child being snatched away, but the woman fleeing into the wilderness and a place prepared for this. It could be Mary. Possibly
Egypt. Did she flee to Egypt when they were looking for them? After Jesus was born, she fled.
Could be. Yeah, it could be. It could also be the people of Israel, right? And your key there would be the 12 stars are the 12 tribes. And the 12 tribes out of the people of Israel comes, and our evangelists, Matthew and Luke, go to great pains with their genealogies, right? To trace the line of Jesus back to Abraham. Both of them do that, and back to Adam. And so it's probably an image of the people of Israel, out of which the Messiah comes. It could be Mary. It could be both. That's the beauty of Revelation, right? It could be both. It's probably an image of the people of Israel who, out of whom comes the Messiah, and he will rule all nations and what have you. And her child, Jesus, is snatched away and taken to God, to his throne. And soon after, Jerusalem is destroyed and the people are scattered once again in a new sort of Babylon type of exile. But there is a place prepared for God, and they will get through this too. One of the big themes of Revelation, and I think we don't read it often in church, is John of Patmos very, very much considers himself to be Jewish. He is Jewish. He's part of the Jewish people. He has issues with the local synagogues and what have you that we read earlier, but he's Jewish, and he also recognizes that and there's a lot of this 12 tribes imagery and 12 elders, but he also recognizes it's doubled often to 24 because of the 12 apostles, and perhaps another image of the rest of the world makes up the other 12 tribes kind of thing. So, and we see this a lot in Paul, that there's first the Jews and then the Gentiles. And so the Jews are not left behind in this at all. I think that's probably what's going on here. But it introduces, we had the beast in the last chapter, and now we have the dragon. And it is, we're going to look at some art in a couple of minutes at the end of this, but this is something that gets tricky to draw. right? A dragon with 7 heads and 10 horns and 7 diadems on his heads. That's an interesting kind of image right there. And again, we get the third of the stars of heaven and earth, right? So we get a lot of this stuff going on. But I think the image of the woman, it could be Mary. It's used in art often as Mary, but it probably is meant also, if not exclusively, to talk about the people of Israel. Anything on this?
What's a portent?
Oh, thank you for saying that. A sign. A
All right.
portent is a sign, and we get that twice, right? We
Yeah.
get great portent and then another portent. So if you start counting, how do you see a sign, right? And this section is sometimes called the 7 signs, and it's not labeled as such because unlike the 7 trumpets or the 7 bowls or the 7 thunders or the 7 seals or the 7 lampstands or the 7 horns, every time it's always talked about as there's 7 of this and then we label them. In this case, interestingly, it does add up to 7, but it's never labeled as 7. And it's a little bit harder to discern. The first 2 are called portents, and then after that, it starts talking about and I saw, and I saw, and I saw. So you do get 7 in this line as well. Let me scroll down and see if we get that here. We'll see as we get through it, but keep your eye out for things like portents and signs and I saw. So this is our first one is the woman with the sun. And then the second one is the dragon appears and the child is snapped away. And we're not done with the second one, just so that we can be clear. And we get yet another reference to Daniel here, by the way, the 1,260 days. Again, that's essentially 3.5 years. That number keeps coming up over and over again. And now we get one of the most famous passages in the book. Charlotte, can you read Michael defeats the dragon?
And war broke out in heaven. Michael and his angels fought against the dragon. The dragon and his angels fought back, but they were defeated, and there was no longer any place for them in heaven. The great dragon was thrown down, that ancient serpent, who was called the devil and Satan, the deceiver of the whole world. He was thrown down to the earth, and his angels were thrown down with him. Then I heard a loud voice in heaven proclaiming, "Now have come the salvation and the power and the kingdom of God and the authority of his Messiah, for the accuser of our brothers and sisters has been thrown down, who accuses them day and night before our God. But they have conquered him by the blood of the Lamb and by the word of their testimony, for they do not cling to life even in the face of death. Rejoice then, you heavens, and those who dwell in them. But woe to the earth and the sea, for the devil has come down to you with great wrath, because he knows that his time is short."
Great. Okay, this is a central passage to the whole book and gives a pretty good summary of what's going on in the whole book. We've had this whole business of things in heaven that look one way and things on earth that look much, much worse. And I think the following aspect of it is important. The child has been snatched away and taken to God. That's clearly Jesus, right? You could certainly read that as anybody that is a follower of Jesus or any prophet prior to that as well. And Revelation generally allows you in all of these things. And case in point is the woman in heaven who could be Mary, could be the people of Israel, could be even a community that brings forth a prophetic witness of some sort. But it's when that, and in this case with Jesus, has happened, the response is that the final conflict in heaven happens and the devil loses and is thrown down to earth. So it's not quite over yet. And there's a lot of imagery from different places. battles of dragons, battles of the woman and the dragon is one, beasts, all this other stuff. If you go all the way back to Genesis, and maybe at some point we'll read Genesis, there's lots of word plays, and we read this on Sunday with the 7-day creation and that sort of thing. Even in Genesis, there's lots of word plays on what would have been familiar to the audience 3,000 years ago or whenever it was written, in terms of the deep in Hebrew, and the chaos that is the water in Genesis is probably a word play on what would have been a familiar Near Eastern god called Chaos and Tiamat, and it's all the same thing, which is a dragon, and God in creation conquers the dragon and destroys chaos. So you've got a little bit of that going on with this in terms of our friend the dragon here, who is thrown down and conquered. You've got clear references back to Daniel, and if you're familiar with it, the Enoch literature about Michael and angels fighting this war in heaven. If you remember from Daniel, Michael comes in flying in on the clouds and probably is the Son of Man in Daniel. And Michael is the sort of great archangel. When you see imagery of Saint Michael, you will always see imagery of Michael beating up a dragon, right? That sort of thing. That imagery continues on afterwards, right? We've got Saint George and the dragon. You've got anytime some great leader wants to slay his or her enemy, it's slaying the dragon, right? And it comes from Revelation, but it predates Revelation a lot. So most of us hear that imagery and think, oh, that comes from Revelation. People reading this would be like, oh, that comes from all over the place. That comes from familiar myths that we would have known about. That comes from Genesis. That comes from Daniel. So that all would be familiar. But the point here is that the devil and his angels are thrown down to earth, which is good on one hand. They're out of heaven, but it's bad on the other hand, because now they're down with all of us. And it begins to make some sense of the problems of the world that we live in from a spiritual side of things. And then, as our John of Patmos author loves to do, they all break into song yet again, right? And you could do well, and we'll see. They talked about the Hallelujah chorus, right? Like that's and he shall, right? And everybody stands up, and to a degree, Revelation, if it was done as a musical, would probably work really well, right? Andrew Lloyd Webber's presentation of the Apocalypse will probably come at some point in our lifetime. So they sing this song, and again, it reiterates a lot of the things that we've already heard about. There's imagery of a legal trial that we've gotten that goes back into places like Job, where Satan is literally the accuser, right? There's imagery of testimony, which goes back into the prophets and also the gospel according to John. There's imagery of, that we've seen already, that brothers and sisters are being thrown down and are being persecuted, but they're going to be raised up. And it's all good because the true battle in heaven has already happened. And so we just have to wait it out here on earth and continue to be faithful, because he knows that his time is short. And we've been getting all this 42 months, 1,360 days, 3.5 years, right? Those are all not that long, but long enough that you're going to have to wait for a bit. Any comments on this? All right, we'll finish this chapter. Who hasn't read? Patrice, can you finish this chapter?
So when the dragon saw that he had been thrown down to the earth, he pursued the woman who had delivered the male child. But the woman was given the 2 wings of the great eagle, so that she could fly from the serpent into the wilderness, to her place where she is nourished for a time and times and a half of time. Then from his mouth the serpent poured water like a river from the woman, to sweep her away with the flood. But the earth came to the help of the woman. It opened its mouth and swallowed the river that the dragon had poured from his mouth. Then the dragon was angry with the woman and went off to wage war on the rest of her children. those who keep the commandments of God and hold the testimony of Jesus. Then the dragon took his stand on the sand of the seashore.
Okay. The woman makes her reappearance here. Again, we're still in our second sign. And I think that the imagery of, or the personification of the woman as the people of Israel. And remember earlier, I said this, John considers himself Jewish, but he also considers himself truly Jewish and not others, right? So this runs into the woman with the rest of her children, certainly at least in terms of Catholic Mariology, is a bit of a problem for identifying the woman with Mary. So it probably is not so much a single woman, it's probably personifying the whole people. And those who remain faithful and yet are still persecuted by the dragon. And again, a lot of the stuff that the dragon does looks like your sort of standard apocalyptic stuff with rivers and floods that are sweeping everything away. Again, if you go back to Genesis, water equals chaos. If you go back into Exodus, water destroys things. If you go back to the flood in Noah, water destroys things. And the woman is able to escape, but again, she's going to be nourished for, right? We keep getting this, a time and times and a half a time. So this 3.5 years, or maybe it's not years, but it's not going to last forever is the whole point of this, that this tribulation will eventually end. And interestingly, the dragon gets mad. I mean, this is one of the funnier lines, I think, in the entire Bible. The dragon goes and sulks, right? Like the dragon gets angry with the woman and goes off to wage war on the rest of her children because he can't get to her. And then he takes his stand on the sand of the seashore. And we will see next week that the sea and the land and some of the relationships with throughout, Israelite history, and certainly at John's time, bad things come from across the sea. Bad things come from far away across the land. Wars come from foreign places, and this is going to begin to look a lot like wars and evil empires coming across the sea or coming across the land towards us. Any comments or questions on this? All right. I'm going to share one more thing before we go, because I've lined it up and I will not have them if I don't do it right now. Can you see this picture? Yes? Okay. So
Yes.
These are some images of Revelation that we've seen thus far. There's our, do you remember this at the beginning? This is the Son of Man with the sword in his mouth, right? And the scroll in his hand, and John is seeing. And note there's 7 lampstands, right? This is Revelation in art. This is, next time you go to an art museum, look for Revelation imagery because you'll find it. It's all over the place. This is, I think, El Greco, the vision of St. John, right? There's, and he's got those angels that don't actually appear in Revelation, which is classic, but he's got your sort of cherub angels and that sort of thing. But there's John. This is the Lion and the Lamb, and there's, I think, our woman. So that's a mix of a bunch of different things from Revelation. But again, that's earlier in the book. There's, what is this? Peaceable Kingdom. This is, I don't know who everybody in here is, but this is a riff off of Isaiah and Revelation, right? The lion shall lie down with the lamb and that sort of thing. So this is your peaceable kingdom. And this looks very American over here. I think somebody may have been playing on this with Thanksgiving or something like that. I don't know if you can see it.
Right.
Right, you see over here. And this is the Ancient of Days on the throne. And this is where you run into fun times. When you start putting 7 horns on your lamb, this is what it looks like, right? Can you see it?
Uh-huh.
And you see how many eyes it has? It's got a bunch of eyes. You have, if you're going to count them, the odds are pretty good that there are 24 of these elders, right, around the throne with their crowns. And here's our angels and our flying things, right, with their 7 wings. And conveniently, the artist has done it in different colors so that you can clearly see that there's 7. And see, there's a leopard and a man, and there's the bird one, and there's the cow one, and those are from Daniel and show up in Revelation. And when we get to the beast, we'll see that they reappear in a negative form. Here is John, angels and clouds and what have you. This is the 7 seals from the scroll being opened. So there's classic, it's not a scroll in this because they used a book, but it's a book with 7 seals on it, and each one is being chained, and inside is a different vision of what happened in the in each seal. And this one is titled, but this is the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse. Up top is our angel. Remember, the angel sends them out. And then here's our 4 horsemen destroying everybody. Then we have different 4 horsemen of the apocalypse. This is a little more useful because the different colors of the horses are shown. But there's your horse of death, which is the last one. And this gives a nice job of, they get creepier as you go along, if you remember. Also, it's worth remembering what they bring. Remember, the white horse seemed to be pretty good, and then the next one brought war, and then the third one brought economic distress, right? See the scale that's there, and then the 4th one brings just straight up death. This is, I think, the 144,000. Let me see. But there's the Lamb on the Mount Calvary, get it, right? And there's the cross right there. And then I don't know if this is 24 or not. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. No, this is there. When you end up counting them, you're into
If
problems.
you count them all, it's 24.
Is it? Okay.
The other 3, yeah, the other 3 make it 24.
Okay. So there's a bunch of them. And anyway, and then there's one more, which is big. This is 7 angels with, what are they carrying?
Trumpets.
7 trumpets, right? So this is Revelation lends itself to art imagery quite a bit. Remember, the sun and the moon is all there, and ships coming, across the sea. And there's, this looks like fire down here. And there's this is clearly woe and destruction falling on the earth. You can see like the locusts, I think that's what that is. Do you see the flying things over here?
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
And destruction over here. It's
What's coming from the bird's mouth?
It's coming when the trumpet blows, bad things happen, right? So you see a trumpet blow over here, and then it does this.
Okay.
And right, you see each trumpet, something is going on. This guy's just carrying his trumpet, but he's got it behind his back. But also he's carrying it too. Anyway, I'm not sure which trumpet we're in right now. He's dropping fire on things, right? You see that? Anyway, and you've got what looks very much like an altar, right? Christian altar with frontal. So all of this is going on. Anyway, that is the art of Revelation is interesting as well. So next week we went tad long. Next week we are going to, it is the discussion that Harry Attridge leads on what we just read is awesome. He just it's beyond crystal clear. So we're not going to start with that because we're going to keep reading about the beasts. But my hope is after we read the beast from the sea and the beast from the land and finish through 14, that we will have the time to do his thing. And I think we have 2 more classes. So the goal is to get through this centerpiece of Revelation before we take a break for the summer. Any final comments or questions? It's interesting. The art helps, I think, get a sense of how does one draw this. So, it's definitely more cartoon. If you were going to do a movie, live action probably wouldn't work as well. It would be more cartoon, but a musical would work. So you get all the song. All right. God bless. Have a good week, and I will see you next week.
Okay, thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you for listening today. If you are interested in subscribing, please do on our podcast. And you can also find all of our Bible studies and other church videos on our YouTube page at YouTube/C/Christ Church Pelham. Or you can just look for it. Christ Church Pelham on YouTube. God bless and take care.